The other half, next on One Gospel. On the mountainside, he appoints the 12 apostles, heals, and gives a sermon, taken from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Questions to consider while you're hearing the text. What makes an apostle successful? And what is a zealot anyway? It came to pass in those days that he went up to the mountain to pray, and continued all night in prayer to God. When it became day, he called those he wanted, and his disciples went away to him, and he chose and appointed 12 from them, whom he also named apostles, that they should be with him, and that he might send them out to proclaim, and to have authority, and to heal sicknesses, and to cast out demons. Simon, whom he also surnamed Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, and he gave them the name Boanerges, which is sons of thunder, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Judah Thaddeus the son of James, and Simon the Canaanite called the Zealot, and Judah Iscariot, who also betrayed him. He came down with them and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of the people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits, and they were healed. The whole multitude sought to touch him, for power went out from him and healed them all. So what's an apostle? Well, we talked about that last week. This was a group of people that he called out of a larger group of disciples. Jesus had already, at least unofficially, created his inner circle of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And of the 12 apostles who are named and chosen at that time, 6 of them were already known to us in the narrative. Simon Peter, Andrew, James and John, Philip, and Matthew, also known as Levi, were all known to us at this time. But here we're introduced to Bartholomew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Judah Thaddeus the son of James, Simon the Canaanite called the Zealot, and Judah Iscariot. So who are these other 6? This is half of the group. And as we learned last week, the significance of the 12 wasn't small. They were meant to ultimately judge the 12 tribes of Israel. They were the future foundation of the New Jerusalem. So who's these other 6? So let's start with Bartholomew. Hippolytus says in the Lives of the 12 Apostles,
Bartholomew again preached to the Indians, to whom he also gave the gospel according to Matthew, and was crucified with his head downward and buried in Alunium, a town of Great Armenia.
Eusebius says in church history,
Pantanaeus was one of these, and is said to have gone to India. It is reported that among persons there who knew of Christ, he found the gospel according to Matthew, which had anticipated his own arrival. For Bartholomew, one of the apostles, had preached to them, and left with them the writing of Matthew in the Hebrew language, which they had preserved till that time.
So here we have 2 independent ancient accounts of Bartholomew having gone very far east. At the time, this would have been the farthest east that the people of the Middle East would have known about. So he went to the people of India, and we're also told that he was martyred by crucifixion in Armenia, which was also east of the Roman Empire. Other traditions say he evangelized Armenia, which would make sense if that's where he died. But all other traditions say he wasn't died by crucifixion, that he died by being flayed alive. Thomas was also known as Didymus. We see that in 2 verses in John. Didymus is a Greek word for twin. And the origin of that name is from Aramaic, which is a form of Hebrew, where the word twin means Toma. So that's where his name Thomas came from. He's quoted later as being willing to die with Jesus right before Lazarus was raised from the dead. So this was probably a month or 2 before Jesus ultimately died. Thomas at that time was ready to die. We also learned that he asked Jesus where Jesus was going when Jesus said he was leaving them. He is famous for having told the other apostles that, he'll only believe Jesus was raised from the dead if he gets to touch his actual body. And when he does meet the risen Jesus, he calls him Lord and God. He was present, according to John 21, at the 3rd post-resurrection appearance in Galilee. This was by the lake. Eusebius quotes a Syriac record that Thomas sent Thaddeus to Edessa, which was a city-state in the land that we would today call Syria.
After the ascension of Jesus, Judas, who was also called Thomas, sent to him Thaddeus, an apostle, one of the 70.
So you see here a couple things. Number one, the Thaddeus he sent wasn't one of the 12 apostles. He was one of the 70, which we learn about later when we move through the OneGospel narrative. We also learned that Thomas he was also known as Judas, which is just Greek for Judah. So we see Judah finding itself in multiple contexts as well. Eusebius later says that Thomas was allotted Parthia when the apostles dispersed and started spreading the gospel to the known world at that time. Ephraim the Syrian wrote a hymn in the 4th century which relates an account of the relics of Thomas. So this was what they thought to be his bony remains coming from India to Edessa. And it sounds like it was in the land of India where Thomas was supposedly martyred.
The evil one wailed, "Where now is there a place for me to flee to from the righteous? I stirred up death to slay the apostles, and I might be safe from their blows. But their deaths now more exceedingly am I cruelly beaten. The apostle whom I slew in India is before me in Edessa. He is here wholly and also there. I went there, and there he was here. Here and there I found him and been grieved. Blessed is the might that dwells in the hollowed bones. The bones that the merchantmen carried, or was it then that they carried him? For lo, they made gain each of the other. But for me, what did they profit me? Yea, they profited each other, each, while to me from both of them there was damage. Oh, that one would show me that the bag of Iscariot, for by it I acquired strength. The bag of Thomas has slain me, for the secret strength that dwells in it tortures me. Moses the chosen carried the bones, in faith as for gain. And if he is a great prophet believe that there is benefit in bones, the merchant did well to believe, and did well to call himself merchant. That merchant made gain, and waxed great, and reigned. His storehouse has made me very poor. His storehouse has been opened in Edessa, and has enriched the great city with benefit.
So this was a song that Ephraim had written or just relayed And we see here that by the 4th century, the Eastern Christians, because this guy's from Syria, he probably lived in Edessa because he saw the relics come to Edessa. They believed that the relics of the apostles had residual power, and that their mortal enemy, the evil one, which you could call Satan or the devil or whatever, that in this epic battle of good versus evil, these relics were a tool for the good in battling the evil. So within this song, though, we see, though, that, again, this reflects the fact that he was originally martyred in India. So it's an ancient tradition. Indian tradition says he came to India in 52 AD, founded churches in 7 cities, went to China, and later died in Mylapore, India, around 72 AD. Hippolytus in the Lives of the 12 Apostles says,
"And Thomas preached to the Parthians, Medes, Persians, Hyrcanians, Bactrians, and the Mergians, and was thrust through in the 4 members of his body with pine spears at Calamine, the city of India, and he was buried there."
So they say that he basically went from just east of the empire, the land of the Parthians. He went through Mesopotamia, where the Medes would be, to where the Persians were, which is Iran. Continued going east, so he would have gone through what is now Afghanistan, Pakistan, ended up in India, and he died from being impaled. He was the supposed author of multiple books that the ancients have passed along, including the Gospel of Thomas, which was Gnostic, and that was found in Egypt. We do quote from that here and there because of its many similarities to sayings of Jesus found in the Christian Gospels. There's also the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which we've also related to when we were talking about Jesus's childhood. And it was that infancy Gospel of Thomas which was identified as heretical as early as the 2nd century by Irenaeus, telling us that that book is, in fact, very, very old, if by the 2nd century it was already viewed as heretical by one of the pillars of the early Christian community. Eusebius specifically denounces as heretical a specific Gospel of Thomas, whether that was the infancy Gospel of Thomas or the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas is not truly known. Another Gnostic book that we found in the Nag Hammadi manuscripts was something called the Book of Thomas the Contender, which identifies Thomas as a twin of Jesus. I say a sort of twin because I don't believe that they thought he was the son of Mary as much as they thought that he looked like Jesus and that's where he got his nickname from as the twin. The Acts of Thomas, which was written in the late 2nd century, described as martyrdom. So moving on to another apostle that we know very little about, James, son of Alphaeus. When we talked about Matthew, we said, hey, actually Matthew's father is named Alphaeus, so it's possible he and James are brothers. Little else is known about him. There is a later tradition that says he was crucified in Egypt, but the earliest traditions actually associated him with James the bishop of Jerusalem, James the apostle, James the brother of the Lord. Papias, who was a 1st century writer, very early, he says,
"Mary, the mother of the Lord, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, or Alphaeus, who was the mother of James, the bishop and apostle, and Simon and Thaddeus, and of one Joseph. Mary Salome, wife of Zebedee, mother of John the evangelist, and James. Mary Magdalene. These four are found in the Gospel. James and Judas and Joseph were sons of an aunt of the Lord's. James also and John were sons of another aunt of the Lord's. Mary, mother of James the Less, and Joseph, wife of Alphaeus, was the sister of Mary, the mother of the Lord, whom John names of Cleopas, either from her father or from the family of the clan, or for some other reason. Mary Salome is called Salome either from her husband or her village. Some affirm that she is the same as Mary Cleophas, because she has two husbands.
And you're like, oh my gosh, what kind of quote is that? Well, if you look here in the middle, it says Mary, mother of James the Less, wife of Alphaeus. So here, he's basically, the point of this is that Papias is trying to explain there's a bunch of different Marys in the Gospels, and he's basically cataloging them so you can know who's who. Well, he's saying that Mary, the wife of Cleophas, which is described in the Gospels, is actually also Mary, the wife of Alphaeus. And so when they say that Mary is the mother of James the Less was basically one James that was mentioned in Mark 15:40 and is often associated with James, the brother of Jesus. Papias would not have accepted that, but he would have said, though, that James the Less is the same as James, the son of Alphaeus. That's the important aspect here. And Hippolytus says,
And James, the son of Alphaeus, when preaching in Jerusalem, was stoned to death by the Jews, and was buried there beside the temple.
This was the fate of James, the brother of Jesus, bishop of Jerusalem, as described by the Jewish historian Josephus, who was not Christian, and Eusebius, the earliest Christian historian. So the association of James, the son of Alphaeus, with James the Less would have been consistent with Hippolytus saying that James, the brother of Jesus, the bishop of Jerusalem, is the guy who was James, the son of Alphaeus. I know this is confusing, but the reason that this became important, at least in early Christian world, was not really having anything to do with James himself. They were actually concerned about the perpetual virginity of Mary, because there was a number of people who felt that Mary had to be a virgin forever and that she could not have had more children. And so if she did not have more children, you have to have an explanation for why there's this guy called James, the brother of Jesus, why we learned that Jesus had brothers, and the brothers' names were James, Jude, Joseph, and Simon. And so those ancient traditions that I just referenced to were later used by Jerome in an argument to say that James, son of Alphaeus, the apostle who we're trying to learn something about from these ancient traditions, he was actually the same person as James the apostle, who was the bishop of Jerusalem, who was the brother of Jesus. But, oh, by the way, he wasn't really the brother of Jesus. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the son of Alphaeus.
No one doubts that there were two apostles called by the name James, James the son of Zebedee and James the son of Alphaeus. Do you intend the comparatively unknown James the Less, who is called in Scripture the son of Mary, not, however, of Mary, the mother of the Lord, to be apostle or not? If he is an apostle, he must be the son of Alphaeus, and a believer in Jesus. For neither did his brethren believe in him. If he is not an apostle, but a third James, who can be, I cannot tell. How can he be regarded as the Lord's brother, and how, being third, can he be called less to distinguish him from the greater, when greater and less are used to denote the relations existing, not between three, but two? Notice, moreover, that the Lord's brother is an apostle, since Paul says, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and tarried with him 15 days. But other of the apostles saw I none, save James, the Lord's brother. And in the same epistle, and when they perceived the grace that was given unto me, James and Cephas and John, who are reputed to be pillars, etc., and that you may not suppose this James to be the son of Zebedee. You have only to read the Acts of the Apostles, and you will find that the latter have already been slain by Herod. The only conclusion is that Mary, who is described as the mother of James the Less, was the wife of Alphaeus, and sister of Mary, the Lord's mother, the one who is called by John the evangelist Mary of Clopas, whether after her father or kindred, or for some other reason.
So Jerome's almost sarcastic, saying, well, okay, listen, we know there's 2 Jameses that were apostles, right? There's James the son of Zebedee and James the son of Alphaeus. But yet we hear about this other James, the James, the brother of the Lord, who was called an apostle. We hear about this guy named James the Less. He's like, what, are you telling me there's some third James? Who could that guy possibly be? Well, anyone who doesn't automatically assume that Mary was a perpetual virgin would say, well, dude, Jesus had a brother. His name was James. That would be the third James. But he can't accept that. So he's being sarcastic and saying, listen, there's only 2. And so, yeah, I know in one place they're called Clopas, in one place it's called Alphaeus. Listen, it's all the same guy, okay? And he can point to an earlier tradition from the 1st century, Papias, who believed the same thing. But at the same time, his argument is undermined by his own words because he is using the Gospels. He acknowledges that Jesus' brothers did not believe in him while he was alive. So if James, the son of Alphaeus, was the same as James, the brother of the Lord, how could we say he didn't believe in him since he followed Jesus and was an apostle? So ultimately, these earliest traditions that associate James, the son of Alphaeus, that they associate him with James, the brother of Jesus, who became bishop of Jerusalem and was ultimately martyred, it's really hard to say that that's at all consistent with the earlier gospel account, which is the earliest account we have of who it is. So what are we left with? We're left with, we really don't know anything about James, the son of Alphaeus, other than to say, he might have really been Matthew's brother. So, who is Judah Thaddeus, the son of James? Now, you'll see the coloring up there, right? I have in yellow Thaddeus. Microsoft calls it dark yellow. I know it's not totally yellow. And then in red, you see Judah, the son of James. That's because Luke calls him Judah, the son of James, and in Mark, he's called Thaddeus. And you might say, well, come on, how do you even know it's the same guy? Well, if you look at the list of 12 apostles, and you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Acts, everybody matches except for Judah, the son of James, and Thaddeus. And so we presume they're the same person. Now, there are some people that don't think they're the same person, but that would be kind of hard to wrap your mind around, because then you're like, okay, you mean he had an apostle that is just mentioned and then disappears and is replaced by someone else without comment? well, I guess, stranger things have happened, but that seems less likely than the fact that he just had different names. And we've already seen that the name Judah, which just means, literally, it literally could just mean, you're associating with being a Jew, especially if you're going out into the world. There's a lot of guys that had the name Judah. So they may have had other names to separate themselves so you know who you're talking about. We only have one quote from this guy, and it's in the Gospel of John.
Judah, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, what has come to pass that you are about to manifest yourself to us, and not to the world?
The King James Version says Judah, the brother of James, instead of Judah, the son of James. The text literally says Judah of James, but the context of the word of almost always means son. But if you decide that it's brother, then that would associate him with the apostle Jude, which wrote a very short book called Jude. And in the first verse, the author of that book says he is Jude, the brother of James. Now there it doesn't say Jude of James, it says Jude, the brother of James. So there it's overt. Again, though, that'd be associating Jesus then with a brother of Jesus. And again, we're told in the Gospels that his brothers didn't believe in him when Jesus was alive. So that, again, doesn't seem consistent at all. It's probably a different guy. Clement of Alexandria, a 2nd century teacher, did say something about Jude specifically.
Jude, who wrote the Catholic epistle, the brother of the sons of Joseph, and very religious, while knowing the near relationship of the Lord, yet did not say that he himself was his brother. But what said he? Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ, of him as Lord, but the brother of James. For this is true, he was his brother, the son of Joseph.
So again, Clement's just talking about Jude. I'm not even saying he's talking about the apostle, but he makes a point of saying that this brother of Jesus made a point of saying he was the brother of James, but a servant of Jesus. And you'll see here, actually, if you read between the lines, that in Egypt, in the 2nd century, there was at least some people that believed that that James and Jude were half-brothers of Jesus, that they were sons of Joseph, but not sons of Mary. So this was, again, a kind of another early explanation of how Mary could have retained her virginity after birthing Jesus. Now, what's this other name, Thaddeus? Thaddeus is said to be a surname by Matthew when Matthew lists the disciples. And so they said that his surname was Thaddeus, but his name was Lebbeus. As mentioned previous, there was another Thaddeus, who was said by Eusebius to be one of the 70. If that were the case, it's possible that the Thaddeus mentioned by Eusebius could have been a relative of this Judah, because Thaddeus was a surname. This apostle was said to have traveled to Armenia along with Bartholomew. The Acts of Simon and Jude, which was written at an unknown date, but probably 2nd century, maybe 3rd, says that he was beheaded in Beirut, in the land at that time of Syria. So, moving on. Who is Simon the Canaanite called the Zealot? Who's this guy? Nothing else is known about him from the Bible beyond the information I just gave you, his name. But even that has ambiguity. Simon's description as a Canaanite could mean he was from Cana. If you remember, Cana was the village where Jesus had his first miracle. At a wedding, he turned water into wine. Back when we were talking about that, we were talking about Jesus's first alchemic miracle because he was changing substances. In Hebrew, the noun for zeal, and zeal is being very, very serious and enthusiastic about a belief, almost a reckless enthusiasm. So it can tip over into negativity. But the noun for zeal is kina or kana. And the verb to be zealous is kana. So either of those words could be transliterated into the Greek kana. You see it's spelled differently, but it's phonetically the same. So it's possible that Luke, with giving us the name zealot, was actually translating the meaning of Simon's description, where Matthew and Mark were just transliterating it. And if it's somebody's name, you generally transliterate it. So, okay, I got Holly to my left here, right? So holly is a bush, right? It's a holly bush. It's a common ornament in the Christmas season. So holly's name literally is referring to a bush. So if I were to speak in Chinese about holly, normally, even if I'm speaking in Chinese, I would still pronounce her name Holly because I wouldn't translate it into the Chinese word for that particular bush. That would be a translation. But you can see how, technically people could go either way with it. So it's possible that zealot and Canaanite truly mean the same thing. A 2nd century writing, Epistle of the Apostles, calls him Judas Zelotes. So here we go again. We got like another guy being called Judas or Jude or Judah. It's all the same thing. Again, if someone were to travel to another land and they were known as a Jewish person, they might have attached that to him, even though that wasn't, the name his mama gave him when he was born. Hippolytus, Bishop of Rome in the 2nd century, says,
Simon the Zealot, the son of Clopas, who is also called Jude, became a bishop of Jerusalem after James the Just, and fell asleep and was buried there at the age of 120 years.
So here we go again, where we are identifying disciples of Jesus with the original bishops of Jerusalem. Because the first bishops of Jerusalem, in history, the first one was James, the brother of Jesus. He was called James the Just by Josephus in his histories because he was known to be a righteous person. So that's how he got that nickname, James the Just. We don't know with certainty that James's brother Simon was the 2nd bishop of Jerusalem, but in our bishop lists from Eusebius, he says that after James it was Simeon. And of course, Simeon and Simon are basically the same name. So you have here another possibility where you could make through a few assumptions saying that, well, actually, if James the Just was really James, the brother of Jesus, and we know from the Gospels that Jesus had 4 brothers, James, Jude, Simon, and Joseph. Well, could Simon the Zealot be the same as Simeon the bishop? Again, that doesn't make sense because he said Jesus' brothers don't believe him when he's alive. So why would Simon the Zealot really be Jesus' biological brother? But there are people that believe actually that there was almost like this little bit of I can't remember the word, but like where they're all in the same family, like a lineage. The original Christian leaders were all related to Jesus. That is not a majority view, and I don't think it is actually a view that holds water, honestly. But that is it's a theory floating around. Moses of Querine writes in the 5th century in his History of Armenia,
"There came then into Armenia the apostle Bartholomew, who suffered martyrdom among us in this town of Arpan. As to Simon, who was sent unto Persia, I cannot relate with certainty what he did, nor where he suffered martyrdom. It is said that one Simon, an apostle, was martyred in Verispor. Is this true? Or why did the saint come to this place? I do not know. I have only mentioned this circumstance, that you may know I spare no pains to tell you all that is necessary."
So the only Simon the Apostle, other than Simon Peter, is this guy, Simon the Zealot, Simon the Canaanite. And so here we have an old tradition that says that he went into Persia and that he was associated with Bartholomew, one of the other apostles, and that he ultimately was killed in a place called Verispor, which was, I'm sorry, I don't know where that is. My guess is that it was in Persia, though. It certainly would have been east of the empire, let's put it that way. In the Arabic Infancy Gospel, so this is one of the ancient Gospels about Jesus' childhood, which we have referred to when we were talking about his childhood. This guy, Simon, who became his disciple, was actually healed by Jesus when they were both children.
In the meantime, while these things were going on, some men came up carrying a boy, for this boy had gone into the mountain with those of his own age to seek the wood, and there he found a partridge nest. And when he stretched out his hand to take the eggs from it, a venomous serpent bit him from the middle of the nest, so that he called out for help. His comrades accordingly went to him with haste, and found him lying on the ground, like the dead. Then his relations came and took him up to carry him back to the city. And after they had come to the place where the Lord Jesus was sitting like a king, and the rest of the boys standing around him like his servants, the boys were hastily forward to meet him, who had been bitten by the serpent, and said to his relation, "Come and salute the king." But when they were unwilling to go, on account of sorrow, in which they were, the boys dragged them by force against their will. And when they had come to the Lord Jesus, he asked them why they were carrying the boy. And when they answered that a serpent had bitten him, the Lord Jesus said to the boys, "Let us go and kill the serpent." And the parents of the boy asked to leave and to go away, because their son was in agony of death. But the boys answered them, saying, "Did you not hear the king saying, 'Let us go kill the serpent'? Then yon not obey him?" And so, against their will, he could be carried back. And when they came to the nest, the Lord said to the boys, "Is this the serpent's place?" They sent that it was. And the serpent, at the call of the Lord, came forth without delay, and submitted itself to him. And he said, "Go away, and suck out all the poison which thou hast infused into the boy." And so the serpent crawled to the boy, and sucked out all of its poison. Then the Lord Jesus cursed it, and immediately on this being done, it burst asunder. And the Lord Jesus stroked the boy, and with his hand, and he was healed. And he began to weep. But Jesus said, "Do not weep, for by and by thou shalt be my disciple." And this is Simon the Canaanite, and of whom mention is made in the gospel.
So this is kind of a wild story, but it still tells you one thing. So in the East, where the Arabic Infancy Gospel existed, and we actually did talk about earlier that this particular gospel was actually was actually influenced at least part of the Quran. But in the East, there was this old story about Simon the Canaanite who was healed by Jesus. So it kind of at least lends credence to the idea that Simon the Canaanite did go to the East. Otherwise, this story about him wouldn't have been produced and disseminated. So moving on, there's been an ongoing assumption that, well, we know about this historical group called the Zealots. So if Simon was called the Zealot, he must have been one of them. Well, who is this group? Josephus describes them as a violent partisan group in War of the Jews. So this would have been around like mid-60s. So this would have been 30 years after Simon the Zealot was called by Jesus.
The best esteemed also of the high priests, Jesus the son of Gamaliel, and Ananias the son of Ananias, when they were at their assemblies, bitterly reproached the people for their sloth, and excited them against the zealots, for that was the name they went by, as if they were zealots in good undertakings, and were not rather zealous in the worst actions, and extravagant to them beyond the examples of others.
So he has nothing good to say about these people. He said, listen, the high priest at the time, and here's another thing. He didn't say there was just one high priest. He said the high priests, more than one. It was one guy, Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, and then there was Annas, the son of Annas. And they were excoriating the people for being lazy. And they excited the people against the zealots. And he makes a point of saying, like, well, they have this name that they're zealots, like they're zealous in doing good things, but really they're zealous in doing the worst actions and extravagant in them beyond the example of others. And I'm telling you, if you read Josephus's accounts, there's lots of really bad things happening. Violent, evil people. And he makes a point of saying these are the worst. So to him, the zealots were the worst of the worst. He also says that they were impious Jews who actually fulfilled a prophecy from God, even though they themselves didn't believe that prophecy.
These men, therefore, trampled upon all the laws of men, and laughed at the laws of God, and for the oracles of the prophets they ridiculed them as tricks of jugglers. Yet did these prophets foretell many things concerning the rewards of virtue and punishments of vice, which when these zealots violated, they occasioned the fulfilling of those very prophecies belonging to their own country. For there was a certain ancient oracle of those men, and the city should then be taken and the sanctuary burnt by right of war, when a sedition should invade the Jews, and their own hand should pollute the temple of the God. Now, while the zealots did not quite disbelieve these predictions, they made themselves the instruments of their accomplishment.
This is really an incredible statement, because Josephus, not a Christian, he's a Jew. The guy says, listen, in general, the prophets of God have said that there's rewards for virtue and punishments for vice. Okay, well, that's a very kind of generic statement, but still a true one, right? But he said there was a specific ancient oracle of those men that the city, meaning Jerusalem, should be taken and the temple burnt in the setting of a war when a sedition means a revolution, an attempt at revolution, when a sedition should invade the Jews. So the Jews revolted against the Romans, right? Because a lot of people didn't like the Romans, but yet it took a critical mass of people hating the Romans that they were actually willing to fight them and die. So And he said that this ancient oracle said that the temple would be burnt, the city would be destroyed when they fought the people who were ruling over them, and that by their own hand, by the Jews' hands, they would pollute the temple of God. And he said, well, the Zealots didn't really believe that prediction. And you might say, what is that prediction? That prediction's from the book of Daniel, which we will get to, and we will get to that because when we talk about Jesus's prophecies of the future, Jesus specifically told the people around him that when you hear about wars, you know that the end is coming near. And he gave them specific signs, but he said, when you see the abomination of the desolation, what does that mean? That means something happens in the temple that's so bad that the actual work of the temple becomes desolate. So the temple itself is profaned. Here Josephus is using the word pollute, but the temple is profaned, so the sacrifices stop. Jesus said, when you see this happen, get the heck out of town because the city's going to be destroyed. Now, Jesus said specifically, when you see the abomination of desolation as described by the prophet Daniel. So Jesus was referring to Daniel. And I think Josephus was referring to Daniel too. Yet at the same time, he was also referring to Jesus. Jesus prophesied that this was going to happen, and the Zealots didn't really believe it, yet they themselves became the instruments of the accomplishment of the destruction of their city and temple when they themselves believed that they were fighting to defend this temple, to defend the city against the Romans. They believed that God was going to come in and save them. When in fact, in the actual revolt against the Romans, the Zealots were worse than the Romans. The Zealots killed more Jews than the Romans did for the first section. The Zealots killed Jews. Well, the Zealots were Jews too. They killed fellow Jews that weren't in their group. They actually killed them in the temple. It was their violent acts in the temple that stopped the sacrifices. And it seems like, you're just thinking about it, like, how could religious people associate being zealot? If they think that they're, defending God, how can they say that you're doing that with violence? Well, that actually, there is a history for that. We're going to talk about that. It makes people uncomfortable, but you know what? We don't hide from topics in One Gospel. We just kind of lay it out there. So this comes from the Hebrew Scriptures. Jehu, who claimed to have the zeal of Yahweh, that's the name of God.
And he said, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." So they made him ride in his chariot. And when he came to Samaria, he slew all that remained unto Ahab in Samaria, till he had destroyed him, according to the saying of the Lord, which he spake to Elijah.
Okay, so Elijah prophesied that after Ahab, that would be it for his line, his dynasty. That was the word I couldn't think of before, dynasty. But anyway, so there was a prophecy from Yahweh, from his prophet, saying, after you, Ahab, you were so evil, this is it. This is it for you in the north. Jehu took it upon himself to kill all of the house of Ahab to make that prophecy be fulfilled. So he felt he was carrying out the will of Yahweh by killing Ahab's sons. Paul, the apostle, the Christian. Well, before he became a Christian, he was known as Saul, and he called himself a zealot. And being a zealot, that led him to persecute the early church.
For ye had heard of my conversation in the time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God, and wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers.
He was zealous of the traditions of his fathers, and that's why he persecuted the church.
I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous towards God, as ye all are this day. And I persecuted this way unto death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women.
So he was zealous toward God, and he was a zealot for God, persecuting people to death, binding and delivering them into prisons, men and women. So the first act of violent zeal, so the word zeal, the first time it was used as an act of violence, was done by Phinehas, who was, this is described in Torah. It was memorialized later in two later Jewish works, 4 Maccabees and Sirach. So this was something that had ongoing influence centuries later.
And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people into sacrifices of their gods, and people did eat and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto Baal-peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said unto Moses, Take all the heads of the people, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, and the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, Slay ye every one of his men that were joined unto Baal-peor. And behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses, in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the men of Israel into the tent, and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly, so that the plague was slain from the children of Israel. And those that died in the plague were 24,000. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Phinehas the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, hath turned my wrath away from the children of Israel, while he was zealous for my sake among them, that I am consumed not the children of Israel in my jealousy. Wherefore say, Behold, I give unto him my covenant of peace, and he shall have it, and his seed after him, even the covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God, and made an atonement for the children of Israel.
So there's a lot here. This makes Christians uncomfortable. This makes Jews uncomfortable. But we're not gonna apologize for it. We're just gonna say, listen, let's look at what's written and let's see what is said. So in Numbers, you have the first generation of the children of Israel had, in a miraculous, amazing circumstances, left Egypt. They are now they are not in the final land that they were promised, but they're right outside it. All God asked them to do was follow me and not the gods around you. What do? Well, they start meeting the other people. They intermix, and they're like, hey, we have our God, you have your God. We can all just, get along. Yeah, you can get along. But, God was, he was angry. The anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel. So, because of this, because he was angry at them following another God so quickly, after he had supported them throughout the wilderness and had delivered them out of slavery, he said, all right, it's time to kill. And Moses, the judge, the highest judge, said to the judges of Israel, because there were judges under Moses that were to carry out the judgment of God, he says, kill everyone that has joined unto Baal Peor. So that was one of the names of the foreign gods. Baal means Lord. I don't remember what Peor means, but it's foreign god that the daughters of Moab were following. So he's like, okay, the judgment is you have committed this sin, you deserve to die. Go out and you have to kill them. In the meantime, there is a plague going through the children of Israel. We don't know what that plague is, but it killed 24,000 people. That itself was considered to be the judgment of God for what was going on. So Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the high priest. So he's in the line of priests, and he sees a guy with his foreign wife who had walked up to Moses in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel. So you have the judgment of God is coming across this people. You have the judge, Moses, saying, everyone who's going to align themselves with this foreign god needs to die. And you have this guy walks right up to Moses with his foreign wife as probably, a way of giving him the finger, right? Like, you're not the boss of me. Or maybe he just thinks, Moses, you're wrong. Hey, man, can't we all just love each other? Can't we all just have a whole bunch of gods? Well, Phinehas saw this happening, picked up a spear, and killed them both. And this is described as zeal. And this was carrying out the judgment of God using immediate violence. And in response to that, Yahweh says to Moses, saying, Phinehas, it's because of your act that I am going to stop the plague. And I'm going to have a covenant of peace with you, Phinehas, and your children are going to have an everlasting priesthood. So here we have from Torah an example where if God's judgment says certain people have to die, carrying out that judgment, especially if other people are probably hesitant about doing it, carrying out that judgment is performing a greater good, and it was specifically honored both by God there and by generations to come. So you can see why a whole bunch of people in later times are like, well, we're doing our violence and it's for the greater good, right? So the noun zealot was also used to describe Jewish Christians who were zealous of the law. So they wanted the law to be followed because they believed, hey, this is God's will, man. And they were concerned that Paul was teaching the Jewish Christians to forsake the law. Jesus himself was described as one with zeal in one specific situation when he cleansed the temple with a whip.
The zeal of your house has eaten me up.
Now that was a quote from a psalm, but they say that the disciples remembered that description when they thought back about what Jesus did in the temple. Now, we don't actually know that Jesus harmed anyone. We just know that he drove out the merchants who were essentially ripping off the people in God's name. They were bringing harm to God's reputation, and they were hurting the people in the process. But we don't know that Jesus actually harmed anyone ever. But we have an example where Jesus had zeal. Same word. But there are times when zealot is, unlike these past things where you see a lot of ambiguity, there are times where zealot is actually good, and it's used in the Christian context. As someone who's zealous for the law, and now this is pre-Christian, but we'll get to the Christian stuff in a bit, but someone who's zealous for the law, Paul tells Christians of Corinth to be zealots. That's the noun, zealots, of good works and spiritual gifts. So there are times where it's used as a positive, but most of the time there's a lot of ambiguity there. It takes a lot of discretion. But again, for people who just want 100% peaceful Christianity or religion or whatever, hey, I get it, man. Blessed are the peacemakers. We're actually going to talk about blessed are the peacemakers in a couple weeks. But, the real world is complicated. So we just let it out. We laid it out. And I personally don't believe that Simon the Zealot was a member of that group of people that were violently trying to overthrow the Romans. I think he was zealous of the law in the sense of a Jew of his time. I think he was zealous of good works, and he may have been from the village of Cana, which got its name from zeal. But, we don't really know. But it does open up the possibility of a lot of interesting discussion. And we're going to end the discussion with the last of the new apostles that we had not been introduced to prior, but are introduced in this passage. And it's the infamous one. I call him Judah Iscariot, and most people know him as Judas, but remember, that's the same thing. He's the guy who ultimately betrayed Jesus. We are told that he was a thief.
He spoke of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for it was he, being one of the 12, who would betray him. He said this, not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box and carried what was put in it.
So we also see here that Judah Iscariot, his dad's name was Simon. Jesus chose him even knowing he was going to betray him. Jesus wasn't surprised by this.
Jesus answered them, "Have I not chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil?"
So if Jesus didn't want to be betrayed, Jesus could have kicked him out way before he was betrayed. This was part of the plan all along. His betrayal was due to satanic influence, though, because we see the mention of Satan in multiple encounters in Luke and John. We see that before Judas went to the chief priest and temple guard, that Satan had inspired the idea to betray him, that Satan had later sort of solidified the action after the Last Supper, but before he had actually betrayed him. So, because anytime you're going to betray someone, it's not like you make a decision in the moment. You have to make the plan. Then when you're having doubts about it, you have to still decide you're going to do it, and then you really need to actually do it. And so we see Satan in each step along the way. And John notes, though, that before the meal, the devil had already put in his heart to betray him. So that was referring to what Luke had said about him going to the chief priests and making the plan to betray him. Here's another thing that makes Christians a little uncomfortable. We're told by Matthew that Judas hanged himself.
And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple, departed, went away, and hanged himself.
We are told by Peter, because Peter was the one who was speaking in the Acts of the Apostles, that Judah died of other causes.
Truly this one purchased a field from the rages of unrighteousness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels poured out.
Yeah. So I have heard people combine them, they're like, hey, he was hung, and when he was hanging there, his bowels burst out. Okay. The only problem with that theory is what's written. It says that in Matthew, he took the silver, threw it back at the priests, departed, and hung himself. And it says in Matthew that the priests purchased a field with the money. And in Luke, it says that this one purchased the field and basically his, had some kind of event where his bowels poured out. I could make that up and say, well, maybe he had Crohn's disease. He had a colocutaneous fistula or something like that. And he actually did have it an open wound that did open and his bowels came out and that killed him. That could happen. Yeah. Anyway, you have two descriptions. I'm not making apologies for it. I'm not making up stories. I'm not saying that they contradict each other. I'm just saying I'm a reporter. This is what it says. The Gospel of Judas, which is not a Christian book, it is a Gnostic book. But the Gnostic Gospel of Judas describes a conversation between Jesus and Judas a few days before Jesus' arrest. So, we've said a lot. Although much is recorded about these six that we said, there really are more questions than answers about who they are and what they did. But if the 12 were sent to the house of Israel, and that's what we talked about last week, and we know that Jewish colonies were in the east and the west. They were all over the known world as known by the people of the Middle East. It's not surprising at all that some of them left the stability of the Roman Empire to go out to those colonies. And because of the relative instability of where they were, they didn't leave us records. They left us legends. But fruit did grow from their labor because Christian communities grew in Syria, Parthia, Armenia, and India. They existed through the ancient times, through to modern times. So the evidence of their work exists. And Jesus said exactly that. He said that would happen.